"You call this garbage food?" my daughter-in-law said loudly enough for everyone at the table to hear. And in that moment, during what was supposed to be our family's Thanksgiving dinner, I realized something inside my own home had already been broken long before that night. Thanksgiving had always been my favorite holiday. For 32 years of marriage, my husband Robert and I hosted it in the same house on Maplewood Drive, the big white colonial with the oak tree in the front yard and the long dining table Robert built with his own hands one summer in the garage. Every year, I followed the same rhythm like a quiet tradition carved into the walls of that house. I woke up early, usually around 6 in the morning, before the sun came up over the rooftops, and the first thing I did was start the turkey. Robert used to say the smell of Thanksgiving should greet people before they even stepped through the front door. Even after he passed away 2 years ago, I kept doing things the same way, partly because it felt right, and partly because it made the house feel less empty. That morning I basted the turkey every 45 minutes, mashed 5 pounds of Yukon Gold potatoes the way Daniel liked them when he was a boy, and made my late husband's favorite cranberry relish from scratch. By the time the clock on the microwave read 3:12 p.m., the kitchen counters were full of dishes: green bean casserole, stuffing with fresh sage, buttered corn, sweet potato pie cooling beside the window. Outside, the November air had that crisp cold that makes people pull their coats tighter around their shoulders. When my son Daniel finally arrived with his wife Jessica, the sun was already beginning to dip behind the houses across the street. Daniel gave me a quick hug at the door, the kind that ends before you really feel it, while Jessica stepped inside, without taking off her sunglasses right away, glancing around the dining room, as if she were inspecting a hotel she wasn't sure about. Jessica had always carried herself with that kind of quiet superiority, the sort of expression that suggested everything around her could have been done better. I tried not to let it bother me. I had learned over the years that peace in a family sometimes required silence. We all sat down at the long table Robert built decades ago, the same table where Daniel had once spilled cranberry sauce at age 8 and cried because he thought he had ruined Thanksgiving forever. Now he sat across from me, scrolling briefly through his phone before setting it beside his plate. I carved the turkey carefully, just like Robert had taught me, the knife gliding through the golden skin while steam rose from the meat. The room smelled warm and familiar, like every Thanksgiving before it. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe things might still feel like a family. Jessica took a bite first. She chewed slowly, her expression tightening in a way that made the air around the table suddenly feel heavy. Then she pushed her plate slightly forward and laughed in a short, sharp way that didn't belong at a holiday dinner. "You call this garbage food?" she said, her voice echoing in the quiet room. The words hung there, sharp and uncomfortable. Daniel didn't say anything. He didn't look at me either. Instead, he stared down at his plate, moving the fork around as if the mashed potatoes had suddenly become the most interesting thing in the world. I felt something inside my chest tighten, but I kept my hand steady on the carving knife. I had lived long enough to understand that some moments reveal truths you didn't know you were ready to see. I set the knife down gently beside the platter. For a few seconds, no one spoke. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the wind brushing the branches of the old oak tree outside. I looked at the table Robert built with his hands, at the food I had spent all day preparing, and then at my son sitting across from me. And in that quiet Thanksgiving moment, I realized this dinner was never really about the food at all. I did not argue with Jessica after she said those words. I did not raise my voice, and I did not defend the meal I had spent the entire day preparing. Instead, I slowly sat down at the table and folded my hands in my lap the same way my mother used to do whenever a moment felt too heavy for words. The turkey was still steaming on the platter, and the mashed potatoes were beginning to cool in the large ceramic bowl I had owned since 1989. The silence around the table stretched longer than anyone seemed comfortable with. Daniel cleared his throat quietly and took a sip of water, but he still did not look at me. Jessica leaned back in her chair as if she had just finished a performance and was waiting for someone to applaud. For a brief moment, I thought about Robert and how different this room used to feel when he was alive. Robert had a way of filling a room with warmth without even trying. When our son was younger, Thanksgiving dinner always turned into laughter and stories and second helpings. Robert used to carve the turkey while pretending to host a cooking show, and Daniel would laugh so hard that he would almost fall out of his chair. Those memories felt very far away that night. I looked down the length of the dining table that Robert built with his own hands more than 30 years earlier. I remembered the summer afternoon when he measured the planks of oak in the garage and told me that one day our grandchildren would sit at that table. At the time, I believed him completely. But as I sat there now across from my son and his wife, the table felt less like a place for family and more like a quiet stage where something unpleasant had finally decided to reveal itself. Jessica reached for her glass of wine and took a slow sip. Then she glanced around the room again with that same evaluating look she often wore when she thought no one was paying attention. It was the same expression she used the first time she visited our home nearly 15 years earlier when Daniel introduced her as the woman he intended to marry. Even then I noticed how carefully she studied everything around her. The size of the living room, the polished wood floors, the old photographs on the mantel. I remembered Robert squeezing my hand later that night after they left, and quietly saying that sometimes people reveal who they are in the way they look at things that do not belong to them. At the time I brushed the comment aside because Daniel seemed happy, and I believed happiness was enough to build a life. Now as Jessica sat across from me, pushing the turkey around her plate as if it were an inconvenience rather than a meal, I began to understand what Robert had meant. Daniel finally spoke after what felt like several minutes of quiet. He said maybe the turkey was a little dry this year, but his voice sounded uncertain, almost rehearsed, as if he was repeating something he had already agreed with earlier. Jessica laughed again and said she had eaten better food at airport restaurants. I noticed how easily the words came to her. They did not sound like frustration about a meal. They sounded like something that had been waiting for the right moment to come out. I slowly reached for my napkin and placed it neatly beside my plate. The clock on the kitchen wall ticked steadily in the background, marking each passing second of that uncomfortable evening. Outside, the wind moved through the branches of the oak tree Robert planted when Daniel was 5 years old. I realized that the quiet in the room was not just awkwardness. It was the kind of silence that appears when people are no longer pretending to be something they once were. And as I sat there looking at my son and the woman he had chosen to build his life with, I began to understand that this Thanksgiving dinner was only the beginning of something far more serious than an insult about food. I remained seated for a few moments after Daniel and Jessica returned to their quiet conversation, but I no longer listened to what they were saying. Instead, my eyes drifted slowly around the dining room, taking in the familiar details that had been part of my life for decades. The cream-colored walls Robert painted himself one autumn weekend. The glass cabinet filled with holiday dishes we collected over the years. The small brass clock above the doorway that Robert wound every Sunday morning without fail. Every object in that room carried a memory, and yet somehow that evening those memories felt like they belonged to another life. Jessica eventually pushed her plate farther away from her and folded her arms as if she had already decided the evening had disappointed her. Daniel tried to change the subject by asking about a football game he had watched earlier that week, but the effort felt thin and uncomfortable. I answered politely when he spoke, yet I could feel the shift in the room as clearly as a change in the weather before a storm. Over the past year, there had been small moments that I had ignored because I believed families should be patient with one another. There were times when Jessica walked through the house while Daniel and I were talking, and she would pause to study the hallway photographs, not with affection, but with calculation. I had also noticed how often she asked questions about the property itself. She would casually mention how large the lot was or how much homes in the neighborhood were selling for lately. At the time, I assumed she was simply curious about the history of the house. But as I watched her now sitting across the table with that same quiet confidence, I began to realize that those questions might not have been innocent curiosity at all. Daniel stood up and carried his plate into the kitchen sink. I heard the faucet turn on, and the steady rush of water fill the room with soft background noise. Jessica remained seated for another minute before following him. I stayed where I was and looked once more at the long oak table Robert built more than 30 years ago. The surface still held faint marks from years of family dinners and celebrations. When Daniel was 12, he accidentally carved a small scratch into the edge while working on a school project. Robert refused to sand it away because he said the table should remember the life that happened around it. I slowly ran my hand along that same edge now and felt the familiar groove beneath my fingertips. The house had always been a place where traditions lived quietly from year to year. Yet that night something about the atmosphere felt different. as if the rhythm that once held our family together had been replaced by something colder and more deliberate. From the kitchen, I could hear Jessica speaking in a low voice. The tone was calm but firm, the way people speak when they believe their plans are already decided. Daniel responded quietly, but his words were harder to hear over the sound of running water. I did not try to listen closely at first. I simply sat there thinking about Robert and the way he used to stand at the end of this table during Thanksgiving and raise his glass before dinner. He always said that a home was not measured by the size of its walls, but by the kindness of the people who lived inside them. As I sat alone in the dining room, I wondered what he would think if he could see the house now. A moment later, Jessica's voice became clearer through the doorway to the kitchen. She said something that made Daniel pause before answering. I could not hear every word, but one sentence carried easily through the quiet house. She said that once everything was settled, the property would be worth far more than it was now. I felt my hand stop moving along the edge of the table. For the first time that evening, I understood that the tension surrounding this Thanksgiving dinner had very little to do with food or family tradition. Something else had been quietly building inside these walls, and I was beginning to suspect that the house Robert and I spent a lifetime creating had suddenly become the center of a conversation that was never meant for me to hear. I did not move when I heard Jessica mention the property. I remained seated at the table with my hand resting against the oak surface Robert had shaped with such care all those years ago. The words echoed quietly in my mind, not loud or dramatic, but deliberate. Once everything is settled, the property will be worth far more. Those were not the kind of words people used during casual kitchen conversations. Those were the words of someone who had already imagined the future and decided what role everyone else would play in it. The faucet in the kitchen finally shut off, and the house fell silent again except for the steady ticking of the clock above the doorway. I looked toward the kitchen, but I did not turn my head fully. Something told me it was better if they believed I had not heard anything. Over the years, I had learned that people reveal more when they think no one is paying attention. I slowly stood from the table and began collecting the plates that still held untouched food. The turkey had cooled completely now, and the mashed potatoes had formed a soft skin on the surface of the bowl. It felt strange clearing away a meal that had barely been eaten, especially one I had spent nearly 8 hours preparing. Yet the action itself felt calming. I carried the dishes into the kitchen and placed them carefully beside the sink. Daniel glanced at me briefly before looking away again, and Jessica offered a polite smile that did not reach her eyes. She asked if I needed help cleaning up, but the way she said it sounded more like a formality than an offer. I thanked her and told her it was not necessary. Daniel picked up his coat from the back of his chair and mentioned that they still had another stop to make before the evening ended. Jessica nodded in agreement as if the plan had already been decided earlier. Within a few minutes they were standing by the front door. Daniel gave me another brief hug, the same quick gesture he had offered when they arrived. Jessica said the dinner had been interesting, and then she stepped outside into the cold November evening. I watched from the window as their car pulled away from the curb and disappeared down the street beneath the yellow glow of the streetlights. The house felt unusually quiet once they were gone. The silence stretched through the hallways and into the kitchen where the scent of roasted turkey still lingered faintly in the air. I returned to the dining room and sat down again at the table Robert built decades earlier. For a long moment, I simply looked around the room, letting the memories settle gently into place. Robert had always believed that a home could tell you the truth if you were willing to listen carefully enough. I thought about the conversations I had overheard in the kitchen, about the questions Jessica asked over the past year about the value of the house and the size of the property. I also thought about the way Daniel avoided my eyes that evening, the way his voice carried uncertainty when he tried to soften Jessica's words. Families do not change all at once. The shift usually happens quietly over time, in small moments that seem harmless until one day the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. As I sat there in the dim light of the dining room, I realized that tonight had simply revealed what had been forming beneath the surface for much longer than I wanted to admit. The house Robert and I built together had always been more than wood and brick. It held the story of our lives, every holiday dinner, every birthday candle, every quiet morning with coffee by the window. But now another story seemed to be growing around it, one that did not include the same sense of loyalty or warmth. And for the first time since Robert passed away, I began to understand that the future of this house might soon depend on decisions I had never expected to face alone. That night, I did not turn on the television, and I did not pour a glass of wine the way I sometimes did when the house felt too quiet. Instead, I walked slowly through each room of the house, the same way Robert and I used to do years ago when we were deciding where to place furniture after we first moved in. The hallway lights cast a soft glow along the wooden floors, and every step echoed gently through the stillness. The house on Maplewood Drive had been part of my life for more than 3 decades, long enough that every corner held a memory. The living room still had the same blue armchair where Robert liked to sit on Sunday afternoons while reading the newspaper. The kitchen window still looked out toward the oak tree he planted the year Daniel turned 5. I paused beside that window for a moment and watched the branches move slowly in the cool night air. Robert used to say that trees told you how long something had truly lasted. The taller they grew, the more seasons they had witnessed. That oak tree had watched Daniel grow from a little boy into a man, and it had watched our family gather around the dining table for holiday dinners more times than I could count. Yet tonight the house felt different, not broken exactly, but unsettled in a way I had never noticed before. I walked into Robert's old study at the end of the hallway and turned on the small desk lamp he always used in the evenings. The warm light filled the room and illuminated the shelves lined with his books and folders. Robert had always been an organized man. Every document had a place, and every drawer held neatly labeled files. After he passed away 2 years earlier, I had not spent much time going through his papers. It felt too much like closing a chapter one was not ready to finish reading. But tonight the quiet conversation I overheard in the kitchen returned to my thoughts with uncomfortable clarity. Once everything is settled, the property will be worth far more. The words had sounded calm and confident, as though the future had already been mapped out without my knowledge. I sat down in Robert's chair and opened the top drawer of his desk. Inside were folders arranged exactly the way he had always kept them. Insurance documents, old mortgage statements, receipts from renovations we completed many years ago. My hand moved slowly across the papers until I reached a thicker folder labeled simply estate planning. I remembered the afternoon Robert came home from meeting with his attorney and placed that folder inside the drawer. He told me it was important for families to make plans so that no one had to worry about difficult decisions later. At the time I nodded and trusted him completely because Robert had always been careful with the future. I opened the folder gently and looked through the neatly arranged pages. The documents were written in formal legal language that took a moment to read carefully. Yet even before I reached the final page, I understood something important. Robert had not only been thinking about the house and the property, he had been thinking about people as well. He knew that time had a way of revealing intentions that were not always spoken aloud. I closed the folder and sat quietly for several minutes, letting the information settle in my mind. Outside, the wind moved again through the branches of the oak tree, and the soft rustling sound drifted through the open window. Robert used to say that patience was one of the most powerful forms of strength because it allowed the truth to unfold on its own. As I turned off the desk lamp and walked back toward the hallway, I realized that the quiet tension of Thanksgiving dinner had not been the end of anything. It had simply been the moment when the truth finally stepped out of the shadows and into the light. I did not sleep much that night after reading the documents in Robert's study. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling while the quiet sounds of the house settled around me the way they always did after midnight. The furnace clicked on every few minutes to keep the November cold from creeping inside, and somewhere outside the wind moved softly through the branches of the oak tree Robert planted years ago. Normally those sounds felt comforting to me because they reminded me that the house was still alive with the rhythm of ordinary life. But that night my thoughts kept returning to the folder I had opened in Robert's desk. The words written in those legal pages had not been emotional or dramatic. They were calm, deliberate, and carefully structured, exactly the way Robert approached every serious decision in his life. He had not only prepared for the future of the house, he had prepared for the possibility that people might one day see that house as something other than a home. When the first light of morning filtered through the curtains, I rose from bed earlier than usual. The kitchen still smelled faintly of Thanksgiving dinner, though most of the food had already been packed into containers the night before. I made a cup of coffee and stood beside the window looking out toward Maplewood Drive. The neighborhood was quiet in that peaceful way suburban streets often are on the morning after a holiday. A few cars were parked along the curb, and thin frost covered the lawns across the street. As I watched the pale sunlight spread slowly over the rooftops, I began thinking carefully about everything that had happened the previous evening. Jessica's words at the table had been loud and humiliating, but strangely enough, those words no longer felt like the most important part of the night. What stayed with me instead was the quiet conversation I overheard in the kitchen, the calm tone in her voice when she spoke about the property, the way Daniel had responded with hesitation but not disagreement. That conversation revealed more truth than the insult ever could. After finishing my coffee, I returned to Robert's study and opened the estate planning folder once again. This time I read the documents more slowly and with greater attention. Robert had always believed that important matters deserved careful understanding rather than quick reactions. As I moved through the pages, I noticed several clauses that described how the house and the surrounding property were to be handled in the future. One section in particular held Robert's familiar handwriting beside the typed paragraphs, a small note he must have added during a meeting with his attorney. The note was simple but unmistakably clear. It reminded the reader that the house was meant to remain a place of stability and respect for the person who continued living there. Robert had underlined that sentence twice with a steady hand. I closed the folder and leaned back in the chair for a moment, letting the quiet of the study settle around me. In that moment, I understood something Robert had tried to teach Daniel many years ago when our son was still young. Robert used to say that a person's character is revealed not by how they behave when everything goes smoothly, but by how they act when they believe something valuable is within reach. I thought about Jessica's questions over the past year, about the way she studied the house whenever she visited, and about the words she used in the kitchen the night before. Those small details now formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Yet I also realized that Robert had already anticipated the possibility of such a pattern long before any of us recognized it. That realization did not make me angry. Instead, it gave me a strange sense of calm. Robert had spent his life building this home and protecting the family that lived inside it. Even after he was gone, it seemed he had continued protecting something far more important than the walls themselves. And as the morning sunlight slowly filled the study, I began to understand that the events of Thanksgiving dinner were not the end of a family tradition. They were simply the moment when Robert's quiet preparations began to matter more than anyone else in the house yet realized. I spent the rest of that morning moving through the house slowly, not because I had anything urgent to do, but because I wanted to observe the quiet details of the place Robert and I had built together. Sunlight stretched across the kitchen floor in long pale lines, and the faint smell of roasted turkey still lingered in the air even after I opened the windows for a few minutes. Thanksgiving decorations still sat on the dining table where I had left them the night before, small autumn candles, and a bowl filled with decorative pumpkins that Robert used to tease me about buying every year. Normally the day after Thanksgiving was when Daniel would return to the house for leftovers, sometimes bringing Jessica with him, and we would sit together for a relaxed lunch that felt much lighter than the holiday dinner itself. But that morning there had been no message and no phone call. The silence between us felt deliberate rather than accidental. I washed the remaining dishes and placed them carefully back in the cabinet, then carried a small stack of containers filled with leftover food to the refrigerator. While I worked, I found myself thinking about Robert's note inside the estate planning folder. The sentence he had underlined twice about stability and respect had stayed with me throughout the morning. Robert had always believed that homes should protect the people who lived inside them rather than the other way around. That belief guided almost every decision he made during the years we spent building our life together. As the afternoon approached, I returned to his study once again and opened the folder for the third time. Each reading seemed to reveal a new layer of meaning. The legal language was careful and precise, but the intention behind it was unmistakable. Robert had written conditions meant to ensure that the house remained the home of the person who continued caring for it and living within its walls. There were also provisions explaining how ownership would be handled if someone attempted to force a change in that arrangement. I read those pages slowly, feeling a quiet sense of understanding settle over me. Robert had not prepared these documents out of suspicion or bitterness. He had prepared them out of experience. During our marriage, he often said that people sometimes reveal unexpected sides of themselves when money or property becomes involved. At the time I assumed he was speaking in general terms about life and business. Now I realized he might also have been speaking about the future of our own family. Later that afternoon, my phone rang while I was sitting near the living room window. The caller identification showed Daniel's name. For a brief moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail, but instead I answered calmly and greeted him the same way I always had. Daniel asked how I was feeling after the previous evening, and his voice carried a cautious tone, as though he were unsure how the conversation might unfold. I told him I was fine and that the house had been quiet that morning. He paused before explaining that Jessica believed the dinner had simply been stressful and that everyone might benefit from a fresh start. The phrase sounded rehearsed, as if it had been discussed carefully before he called. I listened without interrupting and then told him that I appreciated the call. Before ending the conversation, he mentioned that he and Jessica were planning to stop by later in the week to talk about a few practical matters regarding the house. The way he said it confirmed something I had already begun to suspect. Thanksgiving dinner had not been an isolated moment of tension. It had been the opening scene of a conversation that Jessica clearly intended to continue. After I ended the call, I set the phone down on the small wooden table beside Robert's chair and looked once more around the living room. The house remained peaceful, filled with the same familiar light and quiet sounds it had always known. Yet beneath that calm, I sensed that the coming days would bring a conversation Robert had already prepared me to face long before anyone else realized it. I spent the next few days moving through my routine with a calm that surprised even me. On the surface, nothing in the house had changed. The same morning light filled the kitchen every day around 7:30. The same delivery truck passed slowly down Maplewood Drive around 10 in the morning, and the same quiet neighborhood sounds drifted through the windows in the afternoon. Yet beneath that familiar rhythm, I knew something was shifting. Daniel had said they would come by later in the week, and I had no doubt that Jessica would arrive with the same composed confidence she had shown on Thanksgiving. Over the next 2 days, I returned to Robert's study several times, not out of confusion, but out of careful preparation. Each time I reread the estate planning documents, I understood more clearly how thoughtfully Robert had arranged everything. He had always believed that important decisions should never be made in anger or fear. Instead, he believed in patience, in understanding the full shape of a situation before taking even a single step forward. By Wednesday afternoon, the cold November sky had turned a pale gray, and the air carried the quiet stillness that often settles over suburban streets before evening. I was sitting in the living room near the window when I saw Daniel's car pull slowly into the driveway. A moment later, Jessica stepped out of the passenger seat, her coat wrapped neatly around her shoulders as she glanced toward the house with the same evaluating expression I had seen many times before. I opened the door before they could knock. Daniel greeted me politely, and Jessica offered a small smile that felt more formal than warm. We moved into the living room and sat down in the same places we usually did during visits. For a few minutes, Daniel spoke about work and the busy holiday season approaching at his office. Jessica listened quietly until the conversation naturally paused. Then she leaned slightly forward and folded her hands together. Her voice was calm and carefully measured as she explained that she and Daniel had been thinking about the future of the house. She mentioned how large the property was and how much maintenance a place like this required. She spoke about rising property values in the neighborhood and how homes nearby had recently sold for impressive amounts. The words came smoothly, almost like a presentation she had practiced. Daniel nodded occasionally, but said very little. Finally, Jessica suggested that it might be time to consider selling the house and finding a smaller place that would be easier for me to manage. She spoke as if she were offering thoughtful advice rather than proposing a major change to a life built over decades. I listened quietly while she explained her reasoning. The room remained peaceful, the same soft light filling the space, and the same familiar ticking clock marking each passing second. When she finished speaking, she looked at me expectantly, waiting for my reaction. I could see Daniel glance toward me as well, his expression cautious and uncertain. For a moment, I simply looked around the living room at the photographs on the wall and the furniture Robert and I had chosen together many years earlier. Then I stood slowly and told them there was something important I wanted to show them. I walked down the hallway toward Robert's study and returned with the folder I had examined several times over the past few days. The papers inside were arranged neatly just as Robert had left them. I placed the folder on the coffee table in front of them and opened it carefully. Jessica leaned forward slightly, curiosity replacing her earlier confidence. Daniel looked down at the documents with a puzzled expression. I explained calmly that Robert had spent a great deal of time planning the future of this house and the property surrounding it. I told them that the documents described exactly how the house was meant to be handled and who had the authority to make decisions about it. As the quiet room filled with the soft rustle of turning pages, I watched Jessica's expression change from certainty to something far more thoughtful. In that moment, I understood why Robert had always believed that patience was the strongest response when people believed they were already holding the advantage. I watched quietly as Daniel and Jessica read through the pages Robert had left behind. The room remained still except for the soft sound of paper moving across the coffee table. Jessica's expression shifted first. The confidence she carried when she began speaking about selling the house slowly gave way to careful concentration as she scanned the paragraphs in front of her. Daniel leaned forward slightly, reading the lines more than once as if he needed time to understand exactly what they meant. Robert had always written things clearly, but the structure of legal documents often required patience to fully absorb. I remained seated across from them with my hands folded calmly in my lap. I did not interrupt, and I did not explain more than necessary. Robert used to say that the truth is most powerful when people discover it for themselves. After several minutes, Daniel looked up from the folder and then back down again, as if confirming what he had just read. Jessica turned another page, and her eyes moved more slowly this time. The documents explained that the house on Maplewood Drive would remain under my full authority for as long as I chose to live there. Robert had also written clear conditions describing how the property could be managed in the future and who would have the right to make decisions regarding it. Those conditions made one point unmistakably clear. No one could pressure or remove the person living in the house in order to gain control of the property. Robert had underlined that principle during the meeting with his attorney, and seeing his familiar handwriting beside the text made the meaning even more certain. The quiet in the room lasted long enough for the ticking clock on the wall to become the loudest sound between us. Jessica finally closed the folder halfway and looked at Daniel with an expression that was no longer confident or calculating. Instead, it carried the careful awareness of someone realizing that a situation was far more complicated than expected. Daniel leaned back slightly and rubbed his hands together before looking toward me. His voice was softer than before when he asked when Robert had arranged these documents. I told him that Robert had met with the attorney about 2 years before he passed away, during a time when he wanted to ensure that everything in our lives would remain stable even after he was gone. Daniel nodded slowly and looked back down at the papers again. Jessica remained quiet for a moment before asking whether the arrangement meant that decisions about selling the house would only happen if I personally chose to make them. I answered calmly that Robert had designed the plan so the house would remain a home first and an investment second. The distinction was something Robert believed strongly throughout his life. Another quiet pause settled over the room as both of them absorbed that explanation. Outside the living room window, the late afternoon sun had begun to fade, casting long shadows across the lawn and the oak tree Robert planted decades earlier. The branches moved gently in the cool air just as they had on countless evenings before. Eventually, Jessica closed the folder completely and placed it back on the coffee table. Her posture had changed noticeably from when she first arrived. The confident tone she carried earlier was replaced by something quieter and more thoughtful. Daniel looked around the living room at the photographs on the wall and the familiar furniture that had filled this house throughout his childhood. After a moment, he stood up and walked toward the hallway, as if seeing the house again through different eyes. I remained seated and allowed the silence to rest comfortably around us. Robert used to remind me that patience reveals more about people than confrontation ever could. In the end, there was no dramatic argument that evening and no raised voices filling the rooms of our home. Instead, there was only the steady realization that Robert had already understood something about the future long before any of us recognized it. As the fading daylight filled the living room and the quiet rhythm of the house returned to normal, I understood that the story of Maplewood Drive had not been written by one difficult Thanksgiving dinner or one uncomfortable conversation. It had been shaped over decades by the quiet foresight of a man who believed that a home should always protect the person who cared for it most.